The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet cul-de-sac, and my daughter Lila was sitting on the porch in her wheelchair, her small hands gripping the handlebars tightly as she laughed at the gentle chirping of birds. She had always loved this time of day, the golden hour when the world seemed soft and forgiving, when even her disability felt less like a barrier and more like a quiet companion. I watched her from the window of our modest home, smiling at her innocence, unaware that trouble was already creeping across the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. It started with Mrs. Carlton, though most people in our area called her HOA, Karen behind her back. Karen had always been the type to enforce rules with an iron fist, the kind of person who could turn the smallest garden decoration into a neighborhood scandal. She had the uncanny ability to make the simplest acts of joy appear like crimes, and lately, her gaze had been lingering on our property with a subtle, almost predatory intensity. The first time I noticed it, she had been walking her dog, muttering to herself as she passed our yard, her eyes scanning our flower beds as though she were plotting some elaborate accusation. I didn't think much of it at the time. She was just eccentric, and we had learned long ago that eccentric neighbors were best ignored. But there was something in the way she paused outside our gate yesterday that made my skin crawl, a look that promised interference, a brewing storm that I couldn't yet define. Lila didn't notice, of course. She had her headphones on, listening to her favorite music, tapping her fingers in rhythm with the beat, completely absorbed in her own world. Her laughter, so pure and unguarded, should have been a warning to anyone with a heart. Yet, I feared that Karen's heart had long been replaced by something colder, something incapable of recognizing innocence. That afternoon, as I stepped outside to check on Lila, Karen appeared over the fence, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a tight line. She waved, but it wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a calculated display of dominance, a silent assertion that she believed she owned the neighborhood. "You really shouldn't let her play out here all the time," she said, her voice sharp, tinged with judgment. "Neighbors have complained." I forced a polite smile, my hands trembling slightly as I replied, "She's just enjoying the evening. I promise she's safe." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Safe? You call this safe? She could get hurt," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the driveway and the pavement. I tried to keep my tone calm, even though a ripple of fear ran through me. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm keeping a close eye on her," I said. Karen didn't respond, just tilted her head slightly, as if measuring my resolve. Then she turned and walked away, but not before leaving a lingering feeling of unease in the air, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside felt amplified, as if signaling danger. I found myself checking on Lila repeatedly, making sure her wheelchair brakes were secure, ensuring she had her blankets tucked around her legs. My mind wandered to the complaints Karen had supposedly received, wondering if this was a prelude to something worse, some form of retribution that I couldn't yet foresee. Little did I know, she had been planning it for days, meticulously observing every movement, every routine. Her obsession with control, her need to assert power over everyone she deemed beneath her, had reached a dangerous tipping point. The next morning, we tried to return to normalcy. Lila was as cheerful as ever, chatting about her school projects, laughing at her own jokes, and making me forget, for a moment, the cold shadow that Karen had cast over us. But even in her joy, I could feel the tension in the neighborhood. Neighbors were glancing over fences, whispering and avoiding our eyes, as if the mere presence of Karen's scrutiny had created a barrier of fear. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, turned a brilliant shade of orange, Lila begged to go outside again. I hesitated, a pit forming in my stomach, but I couldn't deny her the simple pleasure she craved. With a deep breath, I wheeled her out onto the driveway, letting her listen to the birds and the soft hum of distant traffic. It was then that I saw her, Karen, standing at the corner of the street, phone in hand, seemingly pretending to text, but her eyes were fixed on us, calculating, predatory. My heart raced. I wanted to call her bluff, to tell her to back off, but I knew that any confrontation now could escalate matters beyond control. Lila noticed nothing, spinning slightly in her wheelchair, her laughter ringing like a bell in the quiet evening. And I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. A storm was coming, and nothing I could do would fully prepare us for the chaos that HOA Karen was about to unleash. Seconds later, I caught a glimpse of her lips curling into a faint, cruel smile, and I realized with a shiver that her intentions were far darker than I had imagined. This calm, this deceptive peace, was the lull before a storm that would shatter our lives in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The question that haunted me as I watched her retreat into the shadows was simple yet terrifying. How far would she go, and would anyone be able to stop her before it was too late? The following day dawned with an uneasy stillness, as if the neighborhood itself knew that something dark lingered beneath its picture-perfect surface. I tried to shake off the feeling by focusing on simple routines, brewing coffee, packing snacks for my daughter, and making sure her schoolwork was neatly organized. My little girl, Emily, wore her brightest smile as she wheeled herself into the living room, clutching her sketchbook filled with drawings of flowers, stars, and the family dog. She had always found joy in small things, turning her disability into a backdrop for her creativity rather than a limitation. Her innocence was disarming, and it made what happened next all the more unbearable. Around mid-afternoon, Emily asked if she could go outside to draw. The sun was warm but not overpowering, and the street was unusually quiet. I hesitated. Karen's lingering presence from the night before gnawed at me like a warning, but Emily's eager eyes pleaded with me. Against my instincts, I relented, wheeling her onto the driveway, where she set her sketchbook on her lap and began scribbling happily. I stayed close, watering the plants along the porch, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. That's when Karen appeared. She didn't approach casually. She stormed across the street with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement like a ticking clock counting down to disaster. Her expression was carved from stone, eyes sharp with hostility, and before I could react, she was standing at the edge of our property, arms folded tightly across her chest. "I told you yesterday," Karen snapped, her voice slicing through the still air. "She shouldn't be out here. It's unsafe, and frankly, it's disturbing for the neighborhood." My grip tightened around the watering can. I forced my tone to remain steady. "She's not hurting anyone, Karen. She's sitting on our own driveway, drawing." Karen's gaze flicked to Emily, who had frozen mid-sketch, her pencil trembling slightly in her hand. "Rules are rules," Karen hissed. "The HOA has regulations about unsupervised minors, and she stopped herself, her lips curling cruelly before she continued. "She's already a liability. If she gets hurt out here, it'll be on all of us." My heart hammered against my ribs. "She's not unsupervised. I'm standing right here. And she's not a liability, she's my daughter." Karen smirked, leaning in just enough for her shadow to fall across Emily's sketchbook. "Call it what you want. But people talk. They don't like disruptions. And this," she gestured with a flick of her hand toward Emily's wheelchair, "is disruptive." The word hung in the air like poison. Emily's wide eyes darted toward me, silently asking for reassurance, but before I could respond, Karen reached forward and snatched the pencil from her hand, tossing it onto the ground. If she insists on cluttering up the neighborhood, maybe she should do it inside. That was the breaking point. I stepped forward, my voice sharper now. "Enough, Karen. Step back. You have no right," but she didn't back down. Instead, she leaned closer, her face inches from Emily's. "You think this is your street? You think your special circumstances mean you can bend the rules? Think again." Her words dripped with venom, and Emily's lip quivered, tears welling in her eyes. I moved quickly, placing myself between them, my chest tight with rage. I said, "Step back." I snapped. For a moment, Karen's eyes flashed with something unhinged, a dangerous glint that told me this was more than petty control, it was obsession. Then, with a suddenness that stole the breath from my lungs, she shoved Emily's wheelchair backward, the small wheels bumping hard against the uneven edge of the pavement. Emily cried out, clutching her sketchbook as the chair jolted. Though it didn't tip, the force was enough to send a sickening chill through me. The neighbors saw. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open. A couple across the street froze on their porch, unsure whether to intervene. And yet no one spoke. Karen, emboldened by the silence, straightened her posture, her smug expression daring me to challenge her. "Consider this your final warning," she said coldly. "Keep her inside. Or else." With that, she turned sharply and marched back toward her house, leaving the air heavy with shock and disbelief. Emily sobbed quietly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, her small shoulders shaking. I knelt beside her, my own hands trembling as I tried to soothe her, whispering that she was safe even though my heart screamed otherwise. Rage and fear collided inside me, creating a storm I could barely contain. That night, after Emily finally cried herself to sleep, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the incident over and over. Karen's words, her shove, the way the neighbors had watched in silence, it all burned into my memory. Something inside me shifted. This wasn't a feud anymore. It wasn't a disagreement about rules or noise or decorations. Karen had crossed a line, and I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she wasn't finished. She was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could go before someone stopped her. The question that kept me awake until dawn was terrifying in its simplicity. What would she do next? And would I be able to protect Emily when it happened? The next day carried with it a suffocating tension, as if the very air had thickened with dread. My daughter, Sophie, woke up quieter than usual, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by silence as she stared at her lap while I wheeled her to the breakfast table. The bruise on her arm from Karen's shove yesterday stood out like a cruel reminder of how quickly innocence could be broken. I tried to brighten her mood, making pancakes in funny shapes, but she only picked at her food. The sparkle in her eyes, the one that had carried us through so many difficult days, seemed dimmed. My heart ached, but I told myself I'd do everything in my power to protect her. I didn't know then how quickly that promise would be tested. By late afternoon, Sophie asked if she could sit outside again. My instinct screamed no, but I couldn't bear to cage her inside forever, not because of Karen. If we let her fear dictate our lives, then she had already won. So, against the gnawing pit in my stomach, I agreed, staying close as Sophie rolled her chair onto the driveway with her stuffed bunny in her lap. The sun dipped low, painting the pavement gold. For a brief moment, it felt almost peaceful. And then Karen appeared. She didn't come from across the street this time. No, she stormed straight onto our property, her footsteps heavy, her face twisted with fury, as though she had been waiting all day for this moment. "Didn't I tell you?" She barked, her voice shrill enough to cut through the still air. "I warned you to keep her inside." My body stiffened. "Karen, stop this. You're trespassing," but she was already moving, faster than I expected, closing the distance between us. Sophie froze, her wide eyes filled with fear, her small hands gripping her bunny tight. Before I could step in, Karen's hands shot forward and grabbed the handles of Sophie's wheelchair. With a violent shove, she propelled the chair forward, slamming it hard against the edge of the pavement. The sickening crack of metal scraping concrete echoed in my ears as Sophie screamed, her fragile body jerking from the impact. She toppled sideways, her tiny frame crashing onto the hard pavement, her cheek scraping the asphalt. Time slowed. I heard the thud of her fall, the sound of her breath knocked out of her, the sharp gasp of neighbors who had peeked through their windows. My own voice tore from my throat in a guttural scream as I rushed forward, dropping to my knees beside her. Sophie's face was twisted in pain, blood trickling from a fresh gash on her forehead, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for me. Karen stood above us, chest heaving, eyes blazing with a mix of rage and sick satisfaction. For a heartbeat, she looked almost triumphant, as if hurting a defenseless child had proven her dominance. "I told you she didn't belong out here," she spat, her voice cold, almost gleeful. Rage, unlike anything I had ever felt, surged through me, hot and blinding. "You monster!" I shouted, cradling Sophie in my arms as her tears soaked into my shirt. She's a child. She's my daughter. But Karen didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned closer, her lips curling into a twisted smile. Then keep her out of sight where she belongs. The words punched the air from my lungs. Around us, the silence of a neighborhood was deafening. Curtains fluttered as neighbors pulled back, unwilling to step in, unwilling to confront the tyrant who had taken control of the street with fear. Sophie whimpered against me, her small fingers clutching my sleeve, her body trembling uncontrollably. I wanted to rush her inside, to shield her from Karen's venom, but my body shook with the weight of anger and helplessness. Finally, Karen stepped back, her eyes still locked on me. "Consider this your fault," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You've been warned." And then she turned and walked away, as calmly as if she had merely dropped off a package, leaving us shattered on the pavement. I scooped Sophie into my arms, carrying her inside as fast as I could, my hands slick with her blood, my mind racing with horror. Every breath she took felt fragile, every sob like shards of glass piercing my chest. Once inside, I cleaned her wound, my tears falling freely as I whispered reassurances I wasn't sure I believed. My little girl, who had endured so much already, now lay broken because of the cruelty of a neighbor who believed herself untouchable. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sophie's small body slamming against the pavement, heard her cry of terror, felt her trembling in my arms. Rage boiled in me, but it was laced with dread, because deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her never stopped at one victory. They thrived on control, on breaking others down piece by piece. I sat in the dark, holding Sophie's stuffed bunny in my lap, while she finally drifted into restless sleep. My mind swirled with questions, none of them comforting. Should I call the police? Would they believe me without witnesses willing to speak? Should I confront her directly? Or would that only make her escalate? It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when exhaustion finally dragged me down, that I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about what kind of person I was willing to become to protect my daughter. And as I held Sophie's tiny hand in mine, I knew one thing with certainty: Karen had awakened a fight in me that I hadn't known existed. But what I didn't know was that the next move wouldn't be mine. It would be hers. And when she struck again, someone else would arrive, someone whose very presence would change everything. The morning after Sophie's fall, I woke to the sound of muffled sobs. She sat in her bed, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly against her chest, her hair tangled around her tear-streaked face. The bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight, and every time she shifted, she winced, biting her lip to hold back cries of pain. My heart shattered. No parent should ever have to see their child broken like this, and yet the cruelest part was knowing that it hadn't been an accident. Someone had chosen to hurt her. Someone had made a decision to slam her into the pavement, and that someone was still just across the street, sleeping peacefully as if nothing had happened. I was in the middle of making a doctor's appointment when I heard it, the heavy slam of a car door outside. Sophie's head snapped up, eyes wide, and I rushed to the window. That's when I saw him, a tall man in a crisp uniform stepping out of a black SUV, his badge glinting in the sunlight. His presence was commanding, his movements sharp and purposeful, but what stunned me was where he went. He didn't head toward the HOA office, nor the neighbor's house. He came straight to Karen's front door. Karen opened it with her usual smug smile, but the moment she saw him, her expression faltered. Her confidence cracked. "Thomas," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "What are you doing here?" "Thomas." My stomach clenched. This was no random officer. This was her father. The revelation rippled through me like lightning. Of course. Of course she felt untouchable. Of course she acted like she owned the neighborhood. She wasn't just backed by the HOA, she was protected by blood, by authority, by someone whose very badge could shield her from consequences. I watched from across the street, barely breathing as Sophie whispered in fear, "Mom, Is he here to help us or her? I didn't know. That was the terrifying part. Thomas's voice carried across the yard, low but firm. Karen, I got a call. What the hell have you been doing? Karen stiffened, her face coloring. It's nothing. Just neighbors exaggerating, as usual. You know how they are. His jaw clenched. Neighbors don't call me in the middle of the night, unless something's serious. Tell me what you did. Karen's gaze darted toward our house. For a moment, our eyes met through the window, and the venom in her glare told me she knew exactly what I had seen. She turned back to her father, straightening her posture as if trying to regain her composure. It's under control, she said dismissively. I handled it. But Thomas wasn't convinced. He took a step closer, towering over her. Handled it how? Did you lay your hands on that girl? His voice thundered with authority, but underneath it was something more: fear. Karen faltered. She was in the way, the way. His voice cracked like a whip. She's a child, Karen. A disabled child. What the hell were you thinking? For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I saw Karen lose her grip. Her mouth opened and closed. Her usual sharp tongue rendered useless under the weight of her father's fury. Neighbors had started gathering now, drawn out by the commotion, whispering in clusters along the sidewalks. For years, they had watched her rule this street like a tyrant, but now they leaned forward, eager to see the cracks in her armor. Sophie gripped my hand tightly, her eyes never leaving the scene outside. Is he going to arrest her? She whispered. My throat tightened. I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know. Thomas finally turned his head, his piercing eyes locking onto our window. The weight of his gaze made me freeze, as though he could see straight into the fear pounding in my chest. Slowly, he walked across the street, leaving Karen sputtering on her porch, her face pale and panicked. He stopped at the edge of our driveway, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. Ma'am, he said, his tone measured but heavy with authority, I need to hear from you. Did my daughter lay her hands on your child? My breath caught. His daughter. The truth was out now, and with it came a flood of dread. If I admitted everything, would he protect her? Or would he do what was right? I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling but clear. Yes, she shoved Sophie yesterday, and last night she slammed her into the pavement. My daughter has bruises, cuts, she's terrified. Sophie whimpered softly beside me, as if punctuating my words. Thomas's expression darkened. He closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening as though he were battling a war inside himself. When he opened them again, there was no mistaking the fury there, not directed at me, not at Sophie, but at Karen. I swear to God, he muttered under his breath before turning sharply back toward his daughter. Karen had stepped off her porch, her voice shrill now, desperate. Dad, don't you dare take their side. You're supposed to protect me. Thomas's reply was like ice. Protect you? From what accountability? You think my badge gives you a free pass to assault children? Gasps rippled through the gathered neighbors. For once, the silence didn't favor Karen, it suffocated her. She looked around wildly, searching for someone, anyone to defend her. But all she saw were eyes filled with judgment, with long-suppressed resentment. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. But even as I felt a flicker of hope, a warning curled in my gut. Because people like Karen didn't surrender quietly. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I recognized that dangerous spark returning. She might have been cornered now, but she wouldn't go down without dragging us with her. And as Thomas raised his hand, not in protection, but in restraint, I realized something chilling. This confrontation was far from over. This wasn't the end of Karen's reign, it was just the beginning of the war. The house was quiet, far too quiet for a place that once echoed with Sophie's laughter. After Thomas's confrontation with Karen the night before, the street had settled into an uneasy hush. Neighbors had retreated into their homes, whispering behind closed doors, unwilling to say aloud what they had all seen. My daughter, now called Grace in this part of the story, sat curled up on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, her stuffed bunny pressed against her face. Every time the floor creaked or a car door slammed outside, she flinched, her fragile body tensing as though expecting another attack. The bruises had blossomed darker overnight, purple shadows across her arms and cheek, and the cut on her forehead needed fresh bandages. But it wasn't just her body that bore the scars, it was her spirit. She wouldn't look at the window. She wouldn't roll near the porch. She whispered once, in a trembling voice that shattered my heart. What if she comes back? I wanted to tell her she wouldn't. I wanted to promise her she was safe now. But the truth was, I didn't know. Karen lived across the street, her presence like a loaded gun sitting on the table, waiting for the next spark. The fact that her father, a man with a badge, had called her out so publicly gave me hope, but there was also a gnawing fear. Because blood runs deep, and when forced to choose between justice and family, people don't always make the right choice. Later that morning, Thomas returned. His uniform was gone, he wore plain clothes, but the authority in his stride remained. I braced myself for whatever news he carried, my hand gripping Grace's shoulder protectively. He stepped into the living room, his eyes falling on my daughter. His jaw tightened at the sight of her bruises, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "I filed the report." My breath caught. You did." He nodded. "Protocol doesn't disappear because she's my daughter. Assault is assault. The paperwork is in motion. She'll be questioned." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of relief. But before I could thank him, his voice hardened. "That said, she's not going to take this lying down. Karen doesn't lose gracefully. If anything, she'll double down." Grace whimpered, clutching my sleeve tighter. Thomas looked at her then, his eyes softening. "I'm not here to scare you," he said gently. "I'm here to warn you. Keep her inside. Don't leave her alone. And if Karen so much as looks at her wrong, call me immediately." He left soon after, and though his words had been meant as protection, they only deepened the pit of dread in my stomach. The badge had shifted the balance of power, yes, but it had also drawn new battle lines. Karen had been humiliated in front of the neighborhood, stripped of her illusion of invincibility, and people like her didn't forgive humiliation. That afternoon, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick it up. A neighbor's shaky voice came through the line. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," she whispered. "We saw what happened. We should have stepped in." Her words cracked something inside me. The silence of the neighborhood, the way everyone had watched but done nothing, had weighed heavily on me. Hearing even one person admit guilt felt like a small step toward change. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. "She's been knocking on doors, telling people you're dangerous, saying your daughter made it up for attention." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. "She's lying." "I know," the neighbor whispered, "but not everyone will see it that way. Be careful." That night, Grace barely slept. Every shadow on the wall made her whimper. Every creak of the house sent her scrambling into my arms. I sat awake with her, rocking her gently, whispering lullabies I hadn't sung since she was a toddler. My chest ached with a mix of fury and helplessness. I wanted to protect her from everything, from Karen's lies, from the neighbor's gossip, from the fear that had rooted itself deep in her heart. But the truth was, I couldn't fight shadows. I could only prepare for the moment they stepped into the light. The following days blurred together, each one soaked in unease. Karen's car came and went at odd hours, and sometimes I caught her standing at her window, staring straight at our house. Once, I found a piece of paper stuffed into our mailbox with the words, "Keep her inside or else." My hands shook as I crumpled it, hiding it from Grace, but the message burned into my mind. The police report was supposed to protect us. The badge was supposed to keep Karen in check. But instead, it seemed to fuel her. And the worst part? Grace knew it too. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, "She's not going to stop, is she?" I didn't have the strength to lie. I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead. "No," I admitted softly, "but neither will we." And even as I said it, I wondered if I believed it myself. Because deep down, I knew Karen was planning something bigger, something crueler. something that would push us all to the edge. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. The air felt heavier that evening, as if the entire street was holding its breath. By now, my daughter, renamed Emily in this part of the story, had stopped asking if Karen would come back. She knew. Children sense storms before they break, and Emily's quiet eyes carried the weight of unspoken dread. I had just finished setting dinner on the table when headlights flared through the window, sweeping across the walls like floodlights. My heart stuttered. The hum of an engine idled too long outside, then cut off abruptly. I peered through the blinds, pulse pounding, and there she was, Karen. She stood in the street, her silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp. She wasn't alone. Two neighbors stood behind her, shifting uneasily, their arms crossed. She'd brought an audience, as if she wanted the world to witness what she was about to do. Emily's hand found mine, trembling. "Mom, it's her." I swallowed the knot in my throat. "Stay here," I whispered, though every fiber of me wanted to hide her away. Instead, I stepped onto the porch, the cool night air cutting into my skin. Karen smirked as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "You think you've won?" She hissed, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "You think a little police report changes anything? You're nothing here. You don't belong here." And that child, her eyes flicked toward the window, where Emily peered fearfully through the curtain. "That little cripple has ruined this neighborhood long enough." The words sliced through me like knives. But before I could respond, Karen stormed up the walkway. Her steps were fast, unhinged. I backed away, trying to put distance between her and the front door, my voice trembling yet firm. "Stay back, Karen. You've done enough damage." But she didn't stop. Her face twisted with rage, and for a split second, I thought she was going to shove me aside and march straight inside. That's when Emily did something I'll never forget. She opened the front door and wheeled herself out onto the porch, her little hands gripping the wheels tightly. Her chin lifted in defiance despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "Leave my mom alone," she shouted, her voice raw but steady. "You already hurt me. Isn't that enough?" The neighbors gasped, their murmurs rippling like wind through dry leaves. Karen froze, caught off guard by the sight of the very child she had brutalized standing up for herself, not physically but with a courage so fierce it made even me pause. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe Karen would falter, ashamed under the weight of Emily's words. But instead, her rage deepened. She lunged forward, her hand snapping out as if to grab Emily's chair. That's when headlights blazed again, this time from the opposite end of the street. Tires screeched, and a car swerved to a stop just feet away. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Thomas, not in plain clothes this time, but in full uniform, badge gleaming under the street lamp. His voice thundered across the night. "Karen, step away from her. Now." The authority in his tone froze everyone in place. Karen whipped around, her face pale, her bravado cracking. "Dad," she stammered, but Thomas's glare cut her off. "You've crossed every line," he barked, striding forward. "Do you think this badge exists to clean up your messes? To protect you from the consequences of your own cruelty? Not tonight." Emily clutched my hand, her body shaking, but her eyes never left Thomas as he closed the distance. Karen sputtered, her voice breaking into desperation. I was just trying to." "Enough," Thomas snapped. He pulled out his handcuffs, the metallic click echoing like a gavel. The neighbors gasped louder, some stepping closer now, no longer hiding their curiosity. Karen's confidence crumbled completely as Thomas grabbed her wrists, forcing her arms behind her back. "You're under arrest for assault, harassment, and intimidation," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. Karen thrashed for a moment, shouting incoherently, but Thomas didn't flinch. He hauled her toward the patrol car he'd brought with him, her screams filling the night like the cry of a cornered animal. Emily whispered, almost in disbelief, "He's really doing it." I knelt beside her chair, tears welling in my eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It's over. She can't hurt you anymore." But even as I said it, I knew the scars Karen had left would linger far beyond this night. Emily had faced fear no child should ever know, had carried pain that would take time to heal. Yet, in that moment, watching her small figure sitting tall in her chair as Karen was finally dragged away, I realized something profound. Karen hadn't broken her. If anything, she had awakened a strength I hadn't seen before. The neighbors stood silently as the patrol car door slammed shut, the flashing lights washing the street in red and blue. Some exchanged guilty glances, others nodded at me in quiet acknowledgement. For the first time, they weren't just spectators, they were witnesses, and maybe, finally, they understood the truth. Thomas approached us once more, his face etched with sorrow and resolve. "I should have stopped her sooner," he said softly. "I let her hide behind me for too long. But tonight, I choose what's right." Emily looked up at him, her small voice breaking but strong. "Thank you." And with that, the night closed around us, heavy with exhaustion, but lighter than it had been in weeks. The showdown was over, but the journey wasn't. Healing would take time. Trust would take longer. But for the first time, I believed we might actually make it. The street felt different in the days that followed Karen's arrest. The silence that once carried menace now felt lighter, as if the neighborhood itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. My daughter, renamed Lily in this final part of the story, began to venture near the window again, her curiosity returning in small, cautious doses. She still bore the bruises, but they had softened into fading marks. What worried me more were the invisible ones, the kind no ointment could heal. She had nightmares most nights, waking in tears, whispering, "She's coming back." And every time I would hold her, rocking gently, promising over and over, "You're safe now. She can't touch you anymore." The neighbors, once silent statues in the background of our suffering, began to knock on our door. At first, it was tentative, a basket of muffins left on the porch, a card slipped onto mat. Then came the visits. Mrs. Green from across the street brought flowers and tearfully confessed that she had been too afraid to stand up to Karen. Mr. Lewis offered to mow our lawn. Even teenagers from down the block, who once avoided eye contact, showed up with chalk drawings for Lily, scrawling colorful hearts across our driveway. It didn't erase the pain, but it chipped away at the isolation. For the first time, I realized we weren't alone anymore. One afternoon, Thomas visited again, not in uniform this time, but as a man stripped of pretense. He looked tired, older somehow, his shoulders burdened by guilt. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched. "She'll face charges," he said quietly. "The evidence is clear. The witnesses are speaking. It won't be easy, but this time she'll have to answer for it." His voice cracked at the end, betraying the father beneath the badge. I saw the torment in his eyes, the war between blood and justice. "You did the right thing," I told him, though I knew the cost he was paying. He nodded, staring into the steam of his untouched coffee. "It doesn't feel like it, but I couldn't let her destroy another life, especially not Lily's." He glanced toward the living room, where Lily sat coloring quietly, her small frame hunched but intent. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said enough. As weeks passed, Lily began therapy. At first, she refused to speak during sessions, only staring at the floor with wide, fearful eyes. But slowly, piece by piece, she began to open up. She spoke of her fear, her pain, but also her strength. One day, after a session, she looked at me with a fierce determination I hadn't seen before. "Mom," she said softly, "she hurt me, but she didn't win. Because I'm still here." I hugged her so tightly that she squeaked in protest, but I couldn't let go. That small sentence, "I'm still here," carried more power than any court ruling ever could. When the trial came, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled the benches, no longer silent observers, but witnesses ready to testify. Thomas sat rigid at the front, his presence both haunting and redemptive. And Lily, my brave little girl, wheeled herself up to the stand. The entire room hushed as she took a shaky breath and told her story, every cruel word, every shove, every bruise. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with each sentence. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the judge's voice softened as she thanked Lily for her courage. Karen's face, once smug and unyielding, was pale and defeated. For the first time, she had no power, no audience, no shield. The gavel struck and justice, though delayed, was delivered. In the weeks after, life didn't magically return to normal. It never does after trauma. But there was growth. There was healing. Lily laughed again, real laughter that rang through the house like music. She painted pictures that we taped proudly to the fridge. She dared to wheel herself down the sidewalk, neighbors waving and cheering her on as if she were a hero returning from battle. And, in many ways, she was. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of gold and crimson, Lily sat beside me on the porch. She leaned her head against my arm and whispered, "Mom, do you think I'll always be afraid?" I wrapped an arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "Maybe sometimes," I admitted, "but fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And every day you keep going, you're proving you're stronger than it." She thought about that for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'm really strong." Tears stung my eyes, but I let them fall freely. "Yes, sweetheart, you're the strongest person I know." And as we sat there, the neighborhood around us slowly piecing itself back together, I realized the story wasn't just about Karen's cruelty or Thomas's badge. It was about Lily, her resilience, her defiance, her refusal to let hate define her. It was about the way pain can shatter us, but also how love can rebuild us stronger than before. The storm had passed, leaving scars, yes, but also new roots, deeper and unshakable. And as I held my daughter close, watching her smile at the fireflies flickering in the twilight, I knew one thing for certain. Karen had tried to break her, but in the end, Lily's spirit had triumphed, and that victory would outshine every shadow she had ever cast.